We're all familiar with the novel coronavirus pandemic. We've all lived through it, and it's been quite an experience. You might say it's been 100 years since we had something like this when Spanish flu went through 100 years ago. Although there have been other pandemics, certainly AIDS, someone's called it a slow motion pandemic, now killed about 35 million people worldwide and still ongoing. But this one has been quite a shock to folks in the Western world. Craig, talk to us a little bit about this virus. Was it a surprise?
You know, that's the interesting part, Gene. Risk analysis has been done about what could cause the next pandemic in the previous 25 years. Coronaviruses have been in the top three almost universally. This is not the first time a coronavirus has entered the human population. In fact, it's the seventh time within the last 20 years that we've documented a coronavirus entering the human population. 20% of all common colds are caused by 4 coronaviruses that have been in the human population for a long time. You know, not that long ago, 2002, we had SARS that left China and eventually ended up in Canada and had a high fatality rate. And then in 2012, we had MERS, which is another coronavirus. And so this has been anticipated, maybe even expected, but of course there are other features of this pandemic that have made it quite interesting.
Craig, a big question on everyone's mind is, does this virus mutate? What's the danger of we're vaccinating and yet what is that danger?
So, you know, it hasn't surprised scientists. In fact, it was expected that this virus would mutate. And got a lot of press in the last few months because we're starting to sequence the genome of viruses that we're isolating from people, and we're beginning to notice these mutations more. But there have probably been 30 or 40 variants of this since it started a year ago that have been going through the populations. Generally, viruses mutate 10 to 100 times faster than human cells, and it's kind of their evolutionary capacity to mutate that allows them to continue to cause infections, and we're always a little bit behind till our immune system catches up. So fortunately, most mutations, 99 out of 100, don't confer an advantage, but it appears that because the virus is in so many people, and you know, when you get a viral infection, you may produce 1 trillion viruses and shed, you know, millions. So we expect mutations. There's some mutations going around now. Hopefully, you know, it won't be that big of an issue, at least concerning vaccines.
Okay, so you mentioned that, of course, there are literally hundreds of millions of people packing this around now. Where's the source of it in nature?
Well, most human diseases, in fact, all human diseases originally come from animal sources, Gene, and this is no exception. The documentation from previous coronaviruses is that they come out of bats, particularly in China. Now, 2 of the coronavirus spillover events into humans have come out of bats in China. Camels are the host of the coronavirus in the Middle East. So it's come out of bats. Whether there was an intermediate animal that it got in before it got into humans, we don't know. There are over 500 documented different coronaviruses in bat populations in the world. So
now you hear conspiracy theorists saying that this was engineered. What's your thought on that?
You know, I don't believe it was engineered. There's no evidence. As you mentioned back with the new variants, we've been sequencing this genome. We got literally tens of thousands of sequences, so we have a pretty clear understanding, and it looks like it's of natural origin. So there's 2 ways it could have gotten the human population. It could have got in there just by somebody picking it up from a bat or an animal that was infected by the bat. Or it could have been isolated by scientists, and they could be working with it, a natural pathogenic virus in the lab, and then it infects the scientist that goes home. So I think, you know, those are 2 pretty common theories. Going to be hard to prove that.
Now, when this first hit us in the West, there were lots of rumors about how you could get it, including off a dollar bill or off a piece of paper or something. How is this thing transmitted, and what's the story there?
So it's a classic respiratory virus transmitted by aerosols and droplets. So when you speak, as we're speaking right now, you're producing microscopic droplets that are suspended in the air for a period of time. And these droplets, even though we can't see them, the virus is so incredibly small, they could pack literally hundreds of viruses in this droplet or this aerosol. And this is how they get around. Just when you're in contact with people, you're inhaling these droplets. Sneezing and coughing are what the virus induces the human body to. We call them symptoms. The virus calls it a transmission method. So
should I be afraid of getting it off this piece of paper?
No, that's the curious thing. We call that Foamite transmission or transmission by inanimate objects, and there's no evidence for that. There haven't been any papers published. The closest you could come to that probably would be if I sneezed and loaded it on my hand and touched a doorknob, and then you touch that doorknob within so many minutes, right? But as far as, getting it off a piece of paper or a box of frozen peas, there's just no evidence for that.
Now, another thing that's gone around is this is a super bug you can get more than once.
Yeah, so that's an interesting concept. And, that's a statement that doesn't surprise microbiologists, because if you take 100 people and they get an infection, a few, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5 of those individuals are not going to mount an effective immune response to that infection. Most of us will, so we will not get reinfected, but a few won't. And so I think that's where that story's generated. People are surprised when somebody tests positive and then they get it again, but that's common. We have that happen with chickenpox and strep throat, a lot of infections. People just don't mount a good immune response.
So what are the symptoms of this, and what kind of complications might come even if you recover?
So that is one of the more interesting parts, I think, and a little bit unexpected. For a virus to infect a cell, it has to attach to a specific protein on that cell to gain entry. And the interesting thing about COVID-19 is it binds to a protein that's really common on a lot of cells. Usually, like rabies, only binds to proteins on nerve cells, affects nerve and brain function. So because these ACE proteins are on so many cells, there's a wide range of symptoms. Every time you look, but most commonly it's the classic respiratory symptoms, dry cough, heaviness in the chest, lack of energy because your blood's not getting oxygenated. It doesn't surprise us either as microbiologists that there are going to be some long-term complications. It was surprising years later, after people had fully recovered, we suspected from polio, that we found they had post-polio syndrome, where their body had been damaged by the initial polio infection, and then years later they began to lose functionality. Measles, we think of that as a skin rash, but 1 in 1,000 people it infects their brain and causes encephalitis, or it damages their ears and causes loss of hearing. So there are going to be certainly people who have long-term complications. It's going to be a small percentage of them. It's not for most of us. It's not going to be an issue. We're going to be fine, but that's not a surprise.
Are there nevertheless some kind of unexpected symptoms that come with this one that you guys weren't watching for?
Well, I think just recently, because it's been around long enough now, a year, right, that we've been looking at it, that we realized, for example, just like it happened, ironically, a couple of years after HIV came out, we realized the HIV virus could cause neurological damage and bind to brain cells. And there's some evidence now that some people are having neurological issues with this, a very small percentage. A lot of press has been given to a very small group of people, and it's a serious situation. We call them long haulers. Somehow this virus has triggered their body to do some things it shouldn't. But that's also not surprising, because in tertiary syphilis, often long after the syphilis organism is gone, you can get syphilitic-induced insanity or heart issues or so forth. So
what do we do for people who contract this? What are the treatments?
So You really have just two options with the viral infection. You can develop antiviral drugs that essentially, while you have the virus, these drugs kill the virus, or you can activate your immune system to prevent the virus from causing the infection. That's a vaccine, immunizations. We've had a little bit of success developing antivirals. The great model for this is AIDS or HIV infection, because we've never been able to make a vaccine for a variety of reasons. We've had to develop antivirals, and that took a few years. That just takes, it's kind of a trial and error developing these antivirals. We have a few promising candidates now. We certainly, antibodies, whether it's a convalescent antibody serum plasma from people who've recovered, but right now monoclonal antibodies, which are made in the laboratory, appear to be effective. But our number one way to get this under control is with the vaccine.
Talk about that, please.
So I think the question that always comes up is, man, they're moving fast. And the real question should be, we're just used to them moving so slow on vaccines, but you can move fast. There's a few steps that it takes, but the main step is money. You have to have money to make a vaccine, and one of the great things that has happened during this pandemic is a lot of money has been infused into companies to develop a vaccine. That hurdle has been removed so they can move rapidly. In the last 10 years, science has made a lot of progress in making innovative methodologies, including nucleic acid vaccines, which have been thoroughly tested in livestock and others. So we have an idea about them. So without money as the hurdle, you can move fast. And because it's got so much press, instead of studying a group of 1,000 people, we can get 40,000 volunteers, so we can get a lot more data. The other thing is, it's one thing to develop a vaccine, it's another to scale up and produce it commercially, and it's another to use a supply chain to deliver it. And we've been able to do all three simultaneously because of the money. So I think when people get nervous about it, move too rapidly, what I would say is, why can't we move this rapidly with other vaccines?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this brings me to a social science side of the question, Craig, which is how people have responded to this. And you and I have talked about this a lot, and I've considered it a lot and read a lot from my colleagues about why there has been so much panic and so much misinformation and so much confusion. And I think the number one reason is, look, this is the first time anybody alive has seen anything like this, except for AIDS, which is kind of slow motion and running in the background and mostly in other places. But here we all of a sudden in the West have this nasty virus hitting us, and lots of people getting sick, and all kinds of rumors floating around about the nature of it, some of which you've discussed today. So I think that the newness of it and the first time that we've seen this in 100 years has created all kinds of strange social permutations as we try to deal with this.
Well, I think, and at least in the West, we're not used to having any infringement on our social behavior, right, Gene?
No. The idea that everybody's supposed to wear masks, I mean, we saw massive resistance to that idea. And it took a lot of people a long time to decide, well, maybe we ought to all be wearing masks. And unfortunately, that became politicized. And some people of one side of the political spectrum decided that wearing masks was an infringement on their constitutional rights. And so we had a lot of people in your face refusing to wear masks. And so the response to the pandemic has been really strange in a lot of ways, but the more you think about it and the more you consider from the social scientist perspective how people have responded and why they've responded the way they have, it's understandable. It really does make a lot of sense to understand it. But it has, I think, been sad in many, many ways that it became politicized and polarized the population.
And even weaponized.
The population. And it just...
So I have a question for you, Gene. Now that it's been going for a year, we've been through a lot of things, including a national election.
Yeah.
And taking just a little bit of prognostication here, what do you see if we're going to talk about coronavirus 5 years from now in this class, looking back? What historical impact has this had?
Well, there's no doubt it's been immense. I think historians may argue with much evidence that it had a profound effect on the outcome of the presidential election of 2020. Hard to argue against that. When this hit in March 2020, the economy was at a peak performance we hadn't seen in decades. And the old axiom is that if the economy is doing really well, then the party and the president in power stay there because people have a nice pocketbook. When the virus hit, the economy took a dive, and all of a sudden there were all of these horrible economic manifestations of how the virus was impacting business and industry. And this no doubt had a profound effect on how people then voted when November rolled around. So, yeah, I don't think historians will have any trouble making that case. I think historians will also debate, and there'll be a lot of debate about this, about whether or not the government and society in general responded properly to this. Did the panic have an influence on the way we responded?
You know,
how well did government respond to the panic?
That's what I was thinking. You know, these kinds of things, when you put a political structure, government under stress, this exposes things, doesn't it?
Does. And so, to kind of conclude this, what have we learned on your side and my side from this? I get asked all the time, so when the next pandemic hits, are we going to behave these same ways? And that is a nerve-wracking question, because when you think what we've done because of fear, as well as out of rational need to do what we've done, can we do that every time? Because we're going to get more of these.
I think one good thing that's happened here, Gene, is even though it's not obvious to the general public, to the scientific side, is the ability to understand, gather data, make a vaccine, look at treatments for something that could have just been, it's been bad, but catastrophic. And to have the scientific response has been amazing. It certainly has shown on the scientific and public health side that we need to really pay attention and be prepared, because this will not be the last one, and this may not be the most serious one.
No, it probably will not be. In fact, you've given me lots of literature over the years as we've been working together. This was predicted by your colleagues. They thought it would probably be a super flu bug instead of a novel coronavirus. But we know this is going to happen again. How soon? We don't know. But hopefully we have, as a society and as scientists on your side, learn from this in ways that will benefit us the next time this happens.
That's right. So the story will continue for the next few years.